Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Now let's continue with our story about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. On July 11th, 1899, another Union Pacific train was robbed in Folsom, New Mexico. Although Butch Cassidy was most likely not involved, his associate Elsie Lay was, and Lay, wounded in a subsequent shootout with a pursuing posse, was eventually apprehended, placed on trial for the murder of posse members killed during his pursuit, and given a life sentence, effectively ending his criminal career. Pinkerton investigators also determined that Cassidy and other gang members were all employed using pseudonyms at a remote New Mexico ranch, using the location as a sanctuary unbeknownst to the proprietor. Sensing that the Pinkertons were hot on his trail, Cassidy left New Mexico. This incident and his life in general most likely prompted Butch Cassidy to introspection about the life he was leading. 34 years old, constantly pursued by law enforcement, and forced to live under the most rugged of circumstances, his blond hair was already prematurely gray, his shabby clothing and lined features betraying a difficult existence. It is not surprising that Cassidy spent much of 1900 attempting to figure a way out of the many legal predicaments that were the source of such personal turmoil. He formally approached numerous law enforcement and judicial figures that he knew and respected in an attempt to establish some form of pardon or amnesty that might allow him to pursue a more normal existence. Most of these officials were in Utah, and while they were sympathetic, they maintained that even if they issued some form of pardon or amnesty, it wouldn't help Cassidy in surrounding states where he was still wanted for charges as serious as murder. One idea that actually got off the ground was a proposal to have Butch promise the railroads he wouldn't rob them again as long as they employed him as a guard. Since such a formal agreement would take a face-to-face meeting, negotiations for this kind of legally precarious discussion were conducted through a judge who had previously represented Matt Warner and attorney Douglas Preston, who had personally represented Cassidy. Such a sit-down was scheduled for a remote stagecoach outpost, and on the appointed day, Cassidy arrived. He waited all day, but the Union Pacific officials never showed up. Unfortunately, they were held up by bad weather and managed to make it to the site the following day. By then, Cassidy, angry and thinking this was an attempt by the railroad to humiliate him, was gone after leaving a note under a rock. It read, "Damn you, Preston. You have double-crossed me. I waited all day, but you did not show up. Tell the UP to go to hell, and you can go with them." Douglas Preston did try to patch things up and arrange another meeting, but the incident only seemed to permanently alienate Cassidy from any further attempts at reconciling with civilian life. A train robbery on August 29, 1900, near Tipton, Wyoming, probably ended any chance of the Union Pacific considering Butch Cassidy as a future employee. This time it was Harvey Logan who entered the locomotive engineer's compartment and ordered the train to stop. When it did, Cassidy and others, including the Sundance Kid, attempted to enter the mail car, but incredibly they ran into the same clerk, Ernest Woodcock, who, almost a year earlier, had tried to impede their robbery at Wilcox, Wyoming. Cassidy did not want to utilize dynamite to gain access. Instead, he got the train conductor to coax Woodcock to let the bandits in, telling the obstinate clerk that their entrance was inevitable. Woodcock finally relented, but Butch Cassidy did have to blow open the train's formidable steel safe an explosion that demolished both the mail car and the train car next to it. Although Union Pacific claimed publicly that the gang only got less than $100, a maneuver to discourage other robberies, the take actually exceeded $55,000. But it also brought a strong pursuit from individuals like Joe LaForce and his posse, an effort that came close enough to be visible to the escaping criminals. It was another sign to Butch Cassidy that he needed to get out of the region entirely if he was to remain free from eventual arrest. Butch, Sundance, and another individual, Will Carver, quickly headed a considerable distance west away from both Utah and Wyoming, hiding out at a Humboldt River campsite about 10 miles outside of the northern Nevada town of Winnemucca. A large nearby cattle ranch, the CS Ranch, would be hiring temporary help at its annual roundup, and Cassidy and company hoped to blend in as just 3 more unassuming cowhands. But they had no intention of actually securing employment. Instead, they spent their days in the town of Winnemucca itself, casing the First National Bank of Winnemucca. On September 19, 1900, 3 men, alleged to have been Butch Cassidy, Sundance, and Carver, entered the bank with guns drawn, or in the case of Carver, with a rifle concealed under a blanket, Cassidy yelling to patrons and employees to raise their hands. Cassidy got the bank's proprietor, George Nixon, to open the vault while Sundance and Carver filled sacks with gold coins. Within minutes, the 3 bandits withdrew back out into the street, pushing the bank's inhabitants out of the back door. They got on their horses and quickly made their escape along a previously designated route. Unfortunately, one of the sacks containing gold coins came loose, spilling out onto one of Winnemucca's main streets. Pandemonium ensued when Butch Cassidy actually stopped to retrieve the sack and some of the fallen coins, bank employees already in pursuit firing wildly with weapons retrieved from inside the bank. Sundance and Carver fired back, Butch finally getting back on his horse. As always, the robbers were able to pull away from any pursuit, having left fresh horses along the escape route. Their haul that day, about $32,000. Although historical revisionism has attempted to cast doubt on Cassidy and Sundance's involvement, a local marker still credits Butch Cassidy as the man who robbed the First National Bank of Winnemucca on September 19, 1900. A hastily constructed posse's pursuit was so intense that Cassidy, Sundance, and Carver did not stop their flight until they crossed into the state of Idaho. Once again, Butch Cassidy started to rethink how long his luck would hold and how it would possibly continue with such risky endeavors. To that end, all 3 men split up, agreeing to meet again in the frontier town of Fort Worth, Texas. Another entity impacted by criminals and bank robbers, Wells Fargo, had also recently engaged specific individuals to help hunt down or even kill the individuals responsible for robberies involving their business interests, only adding to the heat already being applied to Cassidy and his contemporaries. It was clear that as its population and commerce grew, the western U.S. was no longer a boundless haven for robbers and desperados, plucking the low-hanging fruit of poorly defended remote banks and railroad trains. Corporations had the power and the resolve to defend their assets against such individuals. Slowly, Butch Cassidy and others like him began to realize that whatever future they had would be in some other environment that resembled the Old West of the 19th century. For Cassidy and Sundance, that environment appeared to be in South America. The region greatly resembled the western U.S. in its infancy, with legitimate opportunities in ranching and farming, and some of their contemporaries supplied personal experiences concerning the potential for also robbing banks. By November of 1900, Butch and Sundance had made their way to Fort Worth, hanging out in the notorious red light district known as Hell's Half Acre, a part of town that promised all of the typical debauchery that excited the denizens of a booming cattle town on the outskirts of the western frontier. Cassidy and Longabaugh were joined by Will Carver, Ben Kilpatrick, and Harvey Logan. The men clearly enjoyed themselves in Fort Worth's saloons, almost 1,500 miles away from the scene of their crimes and any lawman who could recognize them, at least so they thought. So loose, and possibly even as the result of inebriation, on November 21st, 1900, the group got the idea to sit for a photograph, choosing a photographer's shop conveniently situated above a saloon they were frequenting called Sheehan's. This enterprise was run by a man named John Swartz, who quickly shot a photo of the five men, dressed in bowler hats and formal attire, many of the district's more upscale hotels and saloons requiring proper dress. Swartz made a dozen copies for the group and kept one copy on display in his showroom. But Swartz also was the official police photographer for the Fort Worth Police Department's mugshots. Every criminal arrested in the city would be dragged down to the photo studio by a detective named Charles Scott. Months after the five outlaws left Fort Worth, Scott saw their photo and thought he recognized one of the individuals, Harvey Logan. He quickly identified Carver and Kirkpatrick from his own police files, but most importantly forwarded the photo to every law enforcement entity in the country, including the Pinkerton Agency in Denver. Pinkerton chopped up the picture to construct wanted photos for all five of the men, these photos appearing in locations and newspapers all across the country. For the first time, recent, recognizable likenesses of some of the most wanted criminals in the United States appeared nationwide. Whether the photograph was the main cause, there was no doubt that by the end of 1901, the Wild Bunch's reign was over. Will Carver was shot to death in West Texas on April 7, 1901. Ben Kirkpatrick was arrested for passing stolen money in November of 1901, received a lengthy prison sentence, and Harvey Logan was arrested in Tennessee in December of 1901. Escaping from jail, he was killed in a gun battle that resulted from a train robbery near Parachute, Colorado. Only Butch and Sundance escaped the scrutiny that resulted from this widespread publicity. That was because they separated and both took circuitous routes to New York City, Sundance accompanied by Etta Place. By then they had resolved to head for South America. February 1901 found the trio enjoying cultural events like Broadway plays, fine restaurants, and purchasing expensive clothing, kind of final send-off from the USA. Just before they sailed to Buenos Aires, February 20th, 1901, another famous photograph was taken of Sundance with Etta Place. Although there was some historical conjecture that Butch Cassidy did not accompany the couple to Buenos Aires and instead headed west for one last train robbery, it is most likely that he was also in Buenos Aires with Sundance and Etta. Within weeks of arriving in Argentina, Sundance opened a bank account and funded it with $12,000. Butch, Sundance, and Etta then traveled through remote areas of the country before finally registering about 25,000 acres of land, intending to homestead on this government-owned property, the land claimed under Butch Cassidy's latest pseudonym, James Ryan. The land was in the Cholilla Valley in the Argentine province of Chubut, near the Andes Mountains and the Chilean border, the property miles from any town and hundreds of miles from any railroad, clearly and most likely intentionally quite remote. A cabin is quickly constructed that even featured a secret basement room in the event of any unwanted intrusions or visits from law enforcement. The ranch was also stocked with numerous sheep, cattle, and horses, the North Americans fitting in and becoming friendly with their ranching neighbors, some of whom were Americans or British expats themselves. In 1902, Sundance and Etta returned to the United States for reasons that have never been substantiated. Most accounts claim that Etta required medical attention that was unavailable in Argentina, but this has never been proven. Upon their return, the trio continued to live way under the radar at their ranch that was only accessible by boat with an additional lengthy ride on horseback. It is believed that for some time, that whatever law enforcement existed in the region was generally aware that at least Cassidy and Longabaugh were not who they claimed they were and were probably wanted somewhere. But for the first few years of the outlaws' residence, local police officials chose to ignore them. Unfortunately, the long and vindictive arm of the Pinkerton Agency had not stopped looking for the fugitives. They went as far as illicitly opening mail sent to Sundance's mother in Pennsylvania and quickly determined the trio's Patagonia location. agents in Buenos Aires contacted Argentinian government officials to inform them that two dangerous fugitives were on the loose in the country's interior. They also widely circulated wanted posters of the two men and even included a photo of Etta Place, as well as Harvey Logan, who was also mistakenly rumored to have fled to South America. These posters also mentioned a $10,000 reward. Word of the Pinkerton efforts reached Cassidy and Sundance, who realized that the reward might motivate any number of formerly apathetic officials or even citizens. They hastily sold their livestock and their properties to a local cattle syndicate and left. One version has the syndicate, run by a group of expats, forcing the two outlaws out by threatening to reveal their exact location to the Pinkertons. In any event, the two men relocated to a remote campsite near Lake Cholilla, where they spent approximately a year. What exactly happened to Etta Place during this time period remains one of the great mysteries of the Old West. At some point, she returned to the United States and disappeared. Some versions have her getting pregnant by another local American while living at the ranch and returning to the U.S. for an abortion and never coming back. Some have her even remaining in South America through 1905, even participating in bank robberies supposedly committed by Cassidy at Sundance in Rio Gallegos, Argentina, and Villa Mercedes, Chile. These allegations really only rest on the fact that both banks were robbed, but Cassidy, Sundance's, and certainly Etta Place's involvement is still merely conjecture. Rio Gallegos, Argentina, is located many hundreds of miles from the Cassidy Ranch, and other American expats were engaged in the crime of bank robbery. Most likely, at this point, Cassidy and Sundance were still attempting to go straight. That both of these bank robberies yielded a great deal of money indicates that it is unlikely, if they were sitting on such large amounts of cash, that the two fugitives would have embarked on their next course of action. After a brief respite in Chile, Butch and Sundance turned up next in Bolivia, obtaining employment at the Concordia tin mines in Tres Cruces, a small town in the Andes Mountains. Cassidy got a job first as a purchaser of livestock and payroll transport, an ironic occupation for a notorious bank and train robber. Cassidy quickly impressed management with his dexterity in safely delivering large amounts of cash and also scrupulously purchasing quality horses and mules and returning any excess funds. Butch was quickly able to secure a job for Sundance, breaking and training these purchased animals. It was now 1906, and Etta Place was certainly out of the picture, her exact departure date in dispute. For over a century, historians have attempted to determine her fate with various guesses involving death in South America, a return to Denver, Colorado, or an assumed identity in Fort Worth, Texas, but no concrete resolution has ever surfaced. Whatever her fate, Butch and Sundance soldiered on, scraping out a living in remote Bolivia. Again, their co-workers sensed that they may have had a dark past, but that was not unusual for expats residing in South America. Of the two men, Cassidy was decidedly the most popular and outgoing, even charismatic. Longabaugh was more withdrawn, even sullen. But because they were capable, hard workers, and at least in dealing with this employer, honest to a fault, both, especially Cassidy, were considered valued employees. They became quite close with the proprietor of the mine, an individual named Percy Siebert. However, as he got older, Sundance had taken to heavy drinking, and in 1908, while drunk in a cantina, he began boasting generally about his bank robberies. Butch, practically paranoid about this type of behavior and the response it might generate, then decided it was time to move on. He stated on several occasions that for the two of them it made sense to never stay in one location for too long. Unfortunately, Butch's paranoia was overblown, as the Pinkerton agency really made money by getting corporations to pay large sums for their fugitive searches, and when large railroads like Union Pacific heard that the criminals were in South America and no longer a threat, they cut off the paid investigations. Unaware, Butch and Sundance quit their relatively comfortable jobs and then found refuge in a gold mining camp run by a British engineer who let them sleep at his campsite for several weeks. Unbeknownst to this individual, A.G. Francis, the two outlaws were planning to rob a bank in the nearby town of Tupiza, Bolivia. Cassidy repeatedly cased this financial institution, only to discover that an effective regiment of the Bolivian cavalry was headquartered nearby the bank, making a heist all but impossible. Butch and Sundance then turned their attention to a mining company payroll that traveled from Tupiza to Quechisla, Bolivia. This firm, the Aramayo Company, would soon be sending an employee named Carlos Pero with a delivery of a rumored 80,000 pesos, almost $500,000 American dollars. Pero would be unguarded and making the trip with his adolescent son and a muleteer to handle the group's mules. He started the 3-day journey on November 3rd, 1908, unaware that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had discreetly observed him leaving the Aramayo Company office. Pero and his group stayed overnight at a company-owned hacienda in the town of Salo, and early the next morning made their way up the trail. When they reached a remote area known as Wakawanyuska, or Dead Cow Hill, they encountered two well-dressed, heavily armed men wearing bandanas and brandishing rifles. The assailants' hats were pulled down so only their eyes were visible, but one of the bandits spoke in English, and Pero did not resist. Unfortunately, he was only carrying about 15,000 pesos, so the two robbers decided to supplement their robbery by taking one of his mules. They then fled, Pero continuing to the nearest town on the trail, where news of the robbery was transmitted throughout the region by telegraph. Instead of fleeing north, the robbers headed back in the direction of Tupiza, and avoiding the town, they continued until reaching the outpost run by A.G. Francis, even telling him of their exploit. Francis had no intention of turning the men in, but when they continued their flight the next day, they firmly insisted that he accompany them, figuring he knew the area and appropriate escape routes better than they did. He complied, not wanting to consider the alternative, and was able to guide them out of the immediate area. The grateful fugitives letting him go. They told him that instead of heading to the Argentine border, that they were going to make their way north to the town of Uyuni. That was familiar to both of them. Late in the afternoon, they reached the remote town of San Vicente, a mining outpost 14,500 feet above sea level. They asked a town official where they could find a place to sleep. This individual, Clito Bayat, responded that the town was too small for such a business, but that they could stay in the private residence of Bonifacio Casasola, who would also tend to their livestock. Casasola also provided beer and sardines, which the two men quickly brought inside their quarters. Bayat then went to another nearby residence where 3 soldiers and a police inspector were also bunking for the night, having just arrived from Uyuni with news to be on the lookout for 2 American bandits. He told them of the recent arrival of the 2 men and added that he had observed the distinctive Aramayo brand on one of the mules when Cassidy removed its saddle. The 4-man posse then loaded their weapons and made their way towards the Casasola residence. The finale of the 1969 20th Century Fox film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid depicts a wild, desperate gun battle between Butch and Sundance and dozens of local militia and Bolivian soldiers, in which the 2 men go out in a heroic blaze of glory after wounding and killing many of their attackers. Although conflicting reports and historical revisionism have greatly obscured what exactly transpired in San Vicente, it seems that the real demise of Butch and Sundance was a lot less dramatic. The entrance to the room that they occupied was situated on a patio, and as the 4 Bolivians traversed this access point in the dark, they were unexpectedly met by Butch Cassidy, who shot and mortally wounded the first soldier in the group. While the soldier, Victor Torres, and the rest of the posse scrambled to safety, Torres quickly died in a nearby house, but not before all 4 returned Cassidy's gunshot with rifle fire of their own. Regrouping quickly, the remaining 3 men positioned themselves near the patio entrance and began shooting in the direction of the doorway and the room itself. The posse's commanding officer told Bayat to organize as many locals as he could to surround the building and cover the roof of the house. As he left to round up the townspeople, Bayat claimed to hear desperate screaming from the outlaws' location, 2 gunshots, and then silence. The posse waited overnight before entering the area. There they found both outlaws, dead. Sundance with bullet wounds in his body and shot once through the head. Cassidy shot in the arm and in the temple. It was quickly concluded that Cassidy, grasping that Sundance was seriously wounded, shot him first and then killed himself. The bodies were then taken to a local cemetery and buried unceremoniously before the end of the day, November 6th, 1908. Like historical figures ranging from Billy the Kid to Amelia Earhart, conflicting stories about the deaths, and even reappearances in the United States of both Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid have proliferated almost from the moment of their alleged demise in San Vicente, Bolivia. Academic presses, in this case the University of Oklahoma and Brigham Young University, published extensive works detailing sightings of Butch Cassidy occurring in the U.S. well into the 20th century. In BYU's case, they published the account of Lula Parker Bentonson in 1975 entitled Butch Cassidy, My Brother. This memoir contained descriptions of Butch suddenly showing up in an expensive automobile for a 1925 reunion that involved his sister Lula, 18 years his junior, as well as many members of his family, including his father. He would disappear just as mysteriously, admonishing the entire group not to reveal his return or anything about him. Probably the most over-the-top anecdote in the entire book claimed that Butch eventually made his way north, escaping from Bolivia, and one day, minding his own business in a bar in Mexico City, he felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Etta Place. She joyfully explained that she and Sundance were living in the Mexican capital, and she and Butch quickly made their way to this residence for a joyful reunion that lasted days. Butch supposedly left the two suddenly at a bullfight, never to see either of them again, merely getting up and leaving them during this event because he supposedly intensely disliked bullfights. In 1977, author Larry Pointer published In Search of Butch Cassidy with the imprint of the University of Oklahoma Press. Pointer painstakingly attempted to document that Butch Cassidy did not die in Bolivia and in fact came back to live in the United States under the name William T. Phillips. Phillips, until he died in 1937 in Spokane, Washington, did nothing to discourage this assertion, and even wrote the manuscript, The Bandit Invincible, which Pointer initially claimed was not a biography of Cassidy, but an autobiography. Pointer and others, with the exception of Butch's sister Lula, maintained for over 30 years that it was highly likely that Phillips was actually Butch Cassidy. But then something unusual in the historical revisionism genre occurred. Pointer, after reviewing another lengthier manuscript also written by Phillips and also entitled The Bandit Invincible, and further extensive research, actually proved that Phillips was another ex-con named William T. Wilcox, who did time with Butch and even lived with him upon their release from the Wyoming State Prison. Wilcox/Williams bore a resemblance to Cassidy and had probably heard enough stories behind bars to convincingly assume Butch's identity. Most likely a reflection of the popular culture stature of the two outlaws, fascination over their fates only grew to the point where, in 1991, a scientific expedition was granted permission to dig in the graveyard in San Vicente, Bolivia, where Butch and Sundance were allegedly buried. This effort was prompted by the research and journalism of Ann Meadows and Dan Buck, who had traversed Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, conducting on-site interviews and traveling in the footsteps of the two men. In their quest to locate and identify the remains of Butch and Sundance, they eventually enlisted Clyde Snow, a noted forensic anthropologist who was involved in the exhumation of notorious Nazi war criminal Joseph Mengele. Numerous bones and a skull from two separate individuals were even removed, but DNA proved that neither were Butch or Sundance. No further exhumation at the cemetery occurred. The remains removed were probably that of a German miner named Gustav Zimmer, who accidentally blew himself up with dynamite. There was far less speculation about Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, because he was an inveterate correspondent with his family, and his letters ceased after the San Vicente shootout. his family members subsequently maintaining that he most likely died during this incident. It may not be a coincidence that Lula Parker Benson did not even begin her account of her brother's return to the U.S. until after the remarkable success of the film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Her manuscript also took several years to publish, with major houses rejecting the effort, after she refused to reveal the location of her brother's grave, after having maintained that this, and even his burial name, was a known but closely guarded family secret. One wonders, with that much at stake, why Lula wouldn't even privately reveal this information. She may have been previously unintentionally candid, when she was once quoted as saying, "We Parkers always enjoyed a good story." Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Information for this podcast came from the books Butch Cassidy, Beyond the Grave by W.C. Jameson, and Digging Up Butch and Sundance by Ann Meadows. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.